In this lecture, I'll introduce the last of the big three moral theories we'll be working with this semester, but I'll also introduce a relevantly similar philosophical concept from Eastern thought. We'll continue to look, and indeed have looked, at views from other cultures, religions, and different walks of life, but we'll keep our focus on the big three: Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, and from now on, also virtue ethics. The grounding for Aristotelian virtue ethics was covered earlier in our lecture on the basic branches of philosophy, so I'll take it mostly for granted that you're already familiar. What distinguishes virtue ethics from consequentialist theories like utilitarianism and deontological theories like Kantian ethics is that it's an agent-centered theory. Whereas the first theories we looked at focused on actions and their consequences and motivations, virtue ethics focuses on the character of the person. So, the question isn't, how can I act good? It's how can I be good? So, we need to know our good to determine how we ought to develop ourselves. And Aristotle teaches us how to do that. All things have a telos for Aristotle. That is, our end, our goal, or our purpose. What we called before, our final cause. Before, we looked at seeds, houses, knives, and other examples. The telos of a seed is to realize its potential of growing into a fully developed plant. So its good, as a living thing, is the maximization of its highest principle of life, or principle of soul in ancient terms. That is, its nutritive principle. We analyze inanimate objects in the same way. What is the final cause of a knife? To cut well. That is its telos. So, it needs the virtue that makes its telos possible, namely sharpness. For the knife, attaining virtue is the result of a craftsman, and if the knife is lucky, it will have a good craftsman. For the seed, its virtue and flourishing depend on favorable weather, appropriate soil, so there's an element of luck involved for it as well. What makes us good is called virtue, or excellence. The excellence of a knife was its sharpness, and our sharpness is virtue. Virtue includes wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, or conscientiousness. There are others, but we'll focus on the cardinal virtues. Clearly, since the virtues require a kind of knowledge, and our highest principle of soul, or life, above the plants and animals, is our rational principle, it will be through developing reason that we can reach our telos, namely, eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, but is more accurately flourishing. It means we've reached our full potential in every principle of the soul. We're firing on all cylinders, from the nutritive principle to the rational principle. Of course, just like for anything else, an element of luck is involved. If you're born into a war-torn environment, meeting basic needs may be difficult, much less satisfying our higher principles of the soul. But if the conditions are right, then it's completely on us to reach eudaimonia. And if we don't, we are to blame, and no one else. So, if our conditions are right, each of the lower principles of the soul are satisfied. Our nutritive principle by adequate nutrition, our appetitive principle by adequate pleasure, our locomotive principle by adequate freedom and exercise of movement, and so on. Once these lower principles are adequately satisfied, that is, not too much or too little of each, then we're well situated to develop our highest principle, namely reason, or the rational soul. Intellectual virtues such as wisdom will require study, research, experience, and development of critical thinking skills and dispositions. But for Aristotle, there are also character virtues like courage, temperance, and justice. We can analyze these virtues theoretically, but it's only through practice that we can fully recognize and internalize them. so becoming virtuous takes a lifetime of work. The character virtues are critical to this discussion because we're concerned with ethics or morality. Character virtues are the moral virtues. To find the moral virtues that we want to develop in ourselves, we need to assess them the same way we did when we analyzed developing the lower principles of the soul. If we get too much or too little nutrition, we can't be said to be flourishing. Similarly, too much or too little motion can also be detrimental. This kind of reasoning is applicable to moral virtues because they also exist in a mean state. Courage, for example, is the mean between overconfidence and cowardliness. Think of a job interview. A virtuous person confidently goes into the interview and goes through the process honestly and confidently. They don't go in and start saying, "When do I start?" and they don't become paralyzed by fear in the waiting room. Becoming a virtuous person, therefore, requires the wisdom to recognize moral virtue and experience practicing virtue enough to habituate it. We'll look at more examples as we move through the applied ethics portion of this course, but think about situations on your own where you can apply this golden mean method of analysis. Another way to answer this question, what is my telos, or purpose, comes from a practical philosophy shared with me by one of my teachers by way of Okinawa. Arsenio Advincula would often teach lessons on Eastern philosophy and Okinawan culture. During one lesson, he taught us the concept of the Ikigai, which means life purpose. The Ikigai is like a practical thought experiment to give you direction in life, and this highly circulated graphic sums it up nicely. If we look at the graphic from top to bottom, moving clockwise, we can see that the outer circle at the top is the ring of what you love, followed by what the world needs, then what you can be paid for, and what you're good at. If you look at the inner overlap between what you love and what the world needs, you see your mission. If you look at the overlap between what the world needs and what you can be paid for, you see your vocation. Between what you can be paid for and what you're good at, that's your profession. Between what you're good at and what you love, that's your passion. Now, if you move into the overlap between the passion and mission, you see that you'll get delight and fullness, but no wealth, because it doesn't share any overlap with what you can get paid for. If you look at the overlap between your mission and your vocation, you see that there's excitement and complacency, but a sense of uncertainty because it's not what you're good at. Where your vocation overlaps with your profession, you may be comfortable, but you get a feeling of emptiness because it doesn't include what you love. Where your profession and passion overlap, you do get satisfaction, but a feeling of uselessness because the world doesn't need it. But if you look at the center, where what you love, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and what you're good at overlap, that's where you find your Ikigai, your reason for being. One objection to Aristotle's virtue ethics that often arises is how vague it is. It doesn't give you a personalized roadmap or a list of rules. It just says that it requires reason and that it takes time. What the Ikigai concept gives us is a kind of practical shortcut we can use as we develop towards Eudaimonia. It is a rational method we can use to elucidate our personal telos. And if this class can help you realize your telos, your Ikigai, then it will have been well worth the trouble. And I hope you do find it.